On the night of March the 14th, 2011, Margaret Keller woke up to silence, but not the soft, familiar quiet of rural Colorado nights. Not the kind where the wind moves through the wheat fields or coyotes call to each other across miles of open land. No, this was a different kind of silence. Heavy, wrong. She reached across the bed, expecting to find her husband's warm shoulder. Instead, her hand touched only cool sheets. The bedside clock glowed 3:47 a.m., its red numbers looking almost irritated. Robert never got up at night. In their 42 years of marriage, the man slept like a stone. Slow, steady breathing, dependable as the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Margaret called his name into the dark farmhouse. The sound drifted through rooms filled with old furniture passed down through 3 generations. Every wall was lined with pictures of family, faces of people who'd lived on this land since 1889. But no voice called back to her. With a growing sense of dread, she slipped on her robe and walked through the house, flipping on lights as she went. Kitchen empty. Living room empty. The bathroom door stood wide open. Nothing inside but shadows and that annoying drip from the faucet Robert had promised he'd fix next week. Near the back door, she noticed his boots were gone, which meant he'd gone outside. But why? Robert Keller was a man who followed routines the way some folks followed religion. He breakfasted at 6, drank coffee at 5:30 while listening to the AMAG report, and went to bed every night at 10:30 after the news. At 67, with arthritis in both knees and a heart condition, he didn't stroll, wander, or take midnight adventures. Every step had a purpose, and he griped about the ones that didn't. As morning crept over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in the soft pinks and golds Robert loved, Margaret stepped out onto the back porch. The barn looked the same as always, its red paint peeling in places they couldn't afford to fix. 3 silos rose like quiet sentinels. The equipment shed sat still and shut. Everything looked normal, yet every part of her felt that nothing was. She called the Logan County Sheriff's Department at approximately 6 a.m. Deputy Christine Walsh arrived 20 minutes later, her patrol car sending up a cloud of dust as it rolled up the long gravel drive. She was young, perhaps 30, and something about the crispness of her uniform, the seriousness of her expression, sent a cold weight settling deep into Margaret's chest. This was real, whatever was going on. It wasn't just some dream. Deputy Walsh walked through the house, her movements slow and deliberate. She photographed the unmade bed, Robert's reading glasses, and the half-read Tom Clancy novel. She checked the back door. No forced entry, no broken lock, no damage at all. Outside, she searched the ground for footprints, and besides the tracks Margaret had made earlier, only one set stood out. Boot prints heading straight toward the eastern field. They followed the tracks together. Margaret's heart pounded so hard that it felt it might shake the wheat stalks around them. The prints stretched 200 yards into the field, still brown from winter, waiting for spring to bring it back to life. And then it ended. Not faded, not washed away. Just ended as if Robert Keller simply walked forward and vanished in thin air. Deputy Walsh radioed for backup. Within an hour, the property buzzed with officers and volunteers from Merino, its small population of 230 showing up almost to the last person. Search dogs sniffed and circled, but found nothing. Metal detectors swept the fields. People called Robert's name across the open land. And as day bled into evening, the hope they carried slowly gave way to questions. Questions no one could answer. Robert Keller had vanished from his own land, leaving behind a wife, a struggling farm, and a mystery that would haunt the community for the next 14 years. In northeastern Colorado, his name eventually became a kind of legend, though not the kind any man hopes for. Some called him stubborn, others called him foolish. Younger farmers, those who'd sold their family land and moved to comfortable homes in Sterling or Fort Morgan, had harsher words. However, Robert never cared much what people called him. Robert Keller had been born right there in the white farmhouse at the end of County Road 34, delivered by his own grandmother, in the same bedroom where he would one day raise his son. His grandfather had broken the land back in 1889, turning untouched prairie into rich farmland with nothing more than a mule team and a willpower that bordered on pure, stubborn madness. His father survived the Dust Bowl through grit alone, refusing to leave even while neighbors packed up and headed for California in long, desperate caravans. The Kellers didn't stop. The Kellers didn't sell. The first offer came in 1991, not long after the Cold War ended, and defense contractors suddenly found themselves looking for new ways to make money. A polite man in a sharp suit showed up in a Lincoln Town car, an almost comical sight parked among tractors and grain trucks. He represented Consolidated Western Mining and claimed geological surveys showed valuable mineral deposits under the Keller land. He made an offer of $400,000. Robert listened kindly, served him a cup of coffee in the same kitchen where 3 generations had eaten breakfast, then walked him back to his Lincoln. He told the man, "Call me," to never come back. But someone always did. Every few years, a new company with a new name and the same hungry eyes would come knocking. And each time, the offer grew. $600,000 in 1995. $900,000 in 1995, 2002. $1.4 million in 2007, right before the economy crashed. Robert's answer did not change. The land wasn't for sale, not for any price, not ever. By 2010, the pressure had become almost constant. To energy companies hunting for natural gas and coalbed methane, the eastern plains of Colorado had become a gold mine. Real estate developers eyed the proximity to I 76 and imagined strip malls, subdivisions, and endless profits. The Keller farm sat on 340 acres of prime land, perfectly situated and stubbornly unavailable. To the outside world, it had become a missing puzzle piece, an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. Margaret, for her part, wished he'd at least consider the offers, not because she wanted to leave, but because the farm was failing. Commodity prices barely covered the cost of fuel. Equipment repairs drained their savings. Property taxes climbed every year like clockwork. Their son Daniel had relocated to Denver after college. He was in insurance now and came around twice a year with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had no interest in farming. There would be no 4th generation of Kellers tilling this land. "What's the point of holding on?" Margaret had asked, not for the first time. But Robert couldn't explain it in simple words. He felt it instead in the early morning silence as he walked his fields, in the soil that crumbled between his fingers, in the way thunderstorms rolled across the prairie, just like they had when his grandfather was young. This land held the bones of his ancestors. It held memories of his father teaching him to drive a tractor at 9 years old. It held the ghost of his daughter, taken by leukemia at 16, laid to rest in the small cemetery 3 miles down the road beneath a cottonwood tree. How do you sell that? How do you put a dollar figure on all of that? Then, in February of 2011, Thomas Wagner showed up. He was representing Prairie Gold Development Corporation, which was a subsidiary of some other corporation Robert couldn't even begin to trace. Wagner was younger than the others, perhaps mid-40s, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. He spread his offer out in the living room while Margaret served coffee. Neither man drank a drop. The offer was staggering, $2.8 million. Cash, closing in 60 days. Wagner had glossy folders full of artist renderings, shopping centers, housing developments, cheerful people walking golden retrievers through parks. As Wagner finished speaking, Robert rose to his feet. "Get off my property," he said quietly. Wagner smiled, a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Keller, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. This is generational wealth. This is your retirement, your son's inheritance." "My son's inheritance is this farm," replied Robert. "Now get out." The smile was gone. Wagner slowly gathered his folders, carefully, every motion precise. He paused at the door. "This is the last offer, Mr. Keller. After this, things get complicated." Robert shut the door in his face. Robert stood in the window and watched as Thomas Wagner's silver Lexus rolled down the long driveway, dust rising in its wake. 3 weeks later, Robert Keller walked into a wheat field and never came back. His disappearance swept through Merino like a fever. The tiny town of 230 became something altogether different for 3 long weeks. a place caught between hope and dread, driven by a desperate need to find answers where none seemed to exist. Sheriff Frank Doyle ran the operation from a command post inside the high school gym. Maps covered the basketball court where kids had played just days earlier. Red pins marked areas already searched. Blue pins marked spots of interest. Yellow pins. Those were pure guesswork, places to check simply because no one knew where else to look. How did a 67-year-old man vanish from his own land? Volunteers showed up in waves. Farmers from the adjacent properties appeared before the sun was up, thermoses of hot, strong coffee in their hands, ready to walk grid patterns across the Keller farm and far beyond it. Shoulder to shoulder, they moved through winter-dead fields, eyes scanning for anything clothing, blood, or even a body that would at least offer the difficult mercy of certainty. The local 4-H club organized meals. Teenage girls who typically spent their spring weekends grooming cattle for competitions now were handing out sandwiches to weary searchers who returned empty-handed day after day. Then on the fourth day, the search and rescue dogs arrived from Fort Collins. German shepherds trained in cadaver searches, dogs who should have been able to sweep 340 acres with efficient precision. What they did instead only deepened the mystery. They picked up a scent near the eastern wheat field, right where Robert's boot tracks ended. They followed that faint trail for maybe 50 yards, and then stopped, sat down, whined. Every dog did the same. Every starting point led to the same cold, inexplicable dead end. The handlers were baffled. Scent trails don't just end. Not like that. Not in still weather. Not on open land. On the seventh day, the Colorado State Patrol sent a helicopter, a Bell 407, to sweep the property from above. Its pilot, Marcus Sullivan, a man who'd located lost hikers in the Rockies and missing kids in the suburbs, later told Sheriff Doyle it was the strangest search he'd ever flown. From the thermal camera's perspective, the land looked completely normal. Deer, a few cows across the fence line, the usual patchwork of heat patterns for early spring on the plains. But there was no sign of a person, no hint of anything out of place, nothing that explained what had happened to Robert Keller. Margaret watched all of this from her porch. She kept an industrial-sized coffee urn, borrowed from the Methodist church, going around the clock. People always needed something in their hands when they didn't know what to say. They told her they were sorry. They told her they'd find him soon. They told her not to lose hope. She thanked them over and over, with a grin that seemed as if it would crack her face in two. Lying awake that night in a house filled with 42 years of memories, she wondered if hope was just another form of cruelty wrapped in kind words. On the third day, Daniel arrived from Denver with his wife Rebecca and 2 kids in tow. He was on emergency leave from work. Margaret could almost see the arithmetic dancing behind his eyes, the silent speculation about how much longer he could stay before work demanded he return. He joined in with the search parties, trudging those self-same fields he had run through as a child. And with each empty day, frustration etched deeper lines into his face. Stubborn like his father, but Daniel didn't have his father's patience. He wanted answers now. The world was supposed to work like one of his spreadsheets, neat, orderly, balanced. None of this made any sense. By the end of March, the volunteer turnout thinned. Planting season loomed. People had farms to run, families to care for, and lives that couldn't stay frozen in uncertainty forever. The command post came down, the maps were folded and stored away. The helicopter returned to regular patrol. Sheriff Doyle held a press conference was held on the courthouse steps in Logan County. Sheriff Frank Doyle's worn face etched with the unmistakable look of a man who felt he'd failed. He said they had no leads, no evidence of foul play, no clue where Robert Keller might be. He promised the investigation would continue, but everyone knew what those promises really meant. The case was going cold. On the first day of April, Margaret stood alone in the silent house and understood with that heavy clarity that she was now the wife of a ghost, caught somewhere between wife and widow, in a place without a proper name. Robert was gone. Searches had come up empty, and spring was arriving whether she was ready or not. In mid-April, the case shifted. Detective Ryan Clark from the Sterling Police Department was called in, an acknowledgement finally that Robert's disappearance wasn't any ordinary missing person situation. Clark was 43, patient and methodical. He was the kind of investigator who solved cases with paperwork and persistence, not dramatic TV-style breakthroughs. After 15 years working rural crime, he knew that in small towns like Merino, when violence happened, money was usually hiding somewhere in the background. So he followed the money. The offices of Prairie Gold Development Corporation were in a converted warehouse in Fort Morgan, about 45 minutes south of the Keller farm. Clark drove up on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, notebook in hand. Thomas Wagner looked surprised to see him. Wagner's office was polished and modern, exposed brick, expensive furniture, everything arranged to send the message. We're successful, we're legitimate, and we belong here. Wagner greeted Clark politely, though there was a thin layer of irritation beneath the surface, the kind someone gets when they know they have to cooperate whether they want to or not. Yes, he said. He had visited the Keller farm on February 21st. Yes, he'd made a $2.8 million offer for the land and its mineral rights. Yes, Robert had refused. Somewhat aggressively, Wagner said, choosing each word like it had been weighed in advance. No, there were no threats. No, he hadn't gone back. Yes, the offer had been withdrawn. Prairie Gold had moved on. He produced neat stacks of paperwork, contracts, surveys, corporate authorizations, all clean, all official, and all orderly. The sort of documentation that painted Prairie Gold as a perfectly normal business, making a perfectly normal offer that simply didn't pan out. Clark copied it all, thanked Wagner, and began the drive back to Sterling with a nagging feeling he couldn't quite shake. It felt like he'd been shown precisely what someone wanted him to see, and nothing more. The following week, he dug into phone records. That's when a strange pattern appeared. Between February 21st and March 14th, the day Robert disappeared, Thomas Wagner had exchanged calls with a Denver number 17 times. The calls each lasted 4 to 7 minutes. The Denver number was for Daniel Keller. When Clark reached Daniel to ask about the conversations, there was a long, uncomfortable pause. 3 seconds that spoke louder than words. Then Daniel explained. Yes, Wagner had contacted him. After the conversation with Robert went badly, Wagner hoped Daniel might convince his father to rethink things. Daniel had tried, but Robert wouldn't even discuss the idea. According to Daniel, the calls were no more than strategy discussions, about possibilities, about whether the family might be open to selling the land someday, perhaps after Robert passed away, a phrase Daniel admitted sounded morbid even to him. But he insisted nothing sneaky was going on, just business, just exploring options. Clark thanked him and hung up, staring at the phone log spread across his desk. Something didn't sit right. Why would a development company need to call the son of a stubborn landowner 17 times in 3 weeks just to talk about polite possibilities and maybe someday conversations? He dug deeper into Prairie Gold's past, and what he found made every instinct he had start humming. Within the past 6 years, it had acquired 14 properties in northeastern Colorado, including properties belonging to families who had refused to sell. And in 8 of those 14 cases, something had occurred between refusal and sale. A barn fire, covered by insurance, a tractor accident, a well that mysteriously collapsed, a sudden medical emergency, a lost calf that led to another disaster. Incident after incident, all unrelated on paper. But the timing lined up just a little too well. The trouble on the Keller farm had started long before anyone went missing. It came in small, unsettling ways that never quite crossed the line into criminal, just enough to wear a family down. A barn mysteriously burned, though thankfully no animals were inside. Equipment was vandalized so badly it cost thousands to repair. Then came a long, miserable water rights lawsuit that drained the family's energy until they finally gave up. Nothing pointed directly to Prairie Gold, yet the pattern was hard to ignore. Misfortune seemed to follow anyone who refused their offers. When Clark dug into Robert's bank records, one detail made his suspicions tighten. In January 2011, just 2 months before Robert vanished, Robert had deposited a $12,000 check. The memo line said consultation fee, and the check came straight from Prairie Gold Development Corporation. When Clark asked Margaret about it, she looked genuinely puzzled. A sum like that would have been a big deal in their household. Robert never mentioned it, never celebrated it, never even hinted at it. She had no idea where it came from. Pressed for answers, Daniel admitted he'd arranged the whole thing. Wagner had suggested paying Robert for meeting with a geologist Prairie Gold wanted to bring onto the property. According to Daniel, it was standard practice, a gesture of good faith. Robert took the money, let the geologist walk the land, and still turned down the final offer. Daniel had hoped the payment might soften his father's resolve. It hadn't. Clark added the mysterious deposit to his ever-growing list of clues, each one innocent on its own, but together forming the uneasy outline of something not quite right. He interviewed Wagner twice more, and each time walked away with perfect answers that didn't sit perfectly. Wagner had an alibi for March 14th. He was in Denver at a development conference surrounded by 200 people. His company had already moved on from the Keller land. He spoke with genuine concern for Robert's safety. But Clark had been a detective long enough to tell the difference between truth and someone performing truth. Wagner's answers were smooth, practiced, like lines he'd said out loud more than once. And those 17 phone calls to Daniel? They lingered in his mind like a loose thread begging to be pulled. By late May, with no body and no evidence of foul play, the investigation hit a wall. Clark had built a file full of oddities and questionable patterns, but nothing a prosecutor could take it to court. The district attorney told him to keep the case open, but to focus on matters where evidence actually existed. Robert Keller had disappeared, and maybe the DA was implying that was all there was to it. Sometimes people vanished. Clark filed his reports, but he couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes wasn't good enough. The truth was, the Keller family hadn't been whole in a long time. The cracks had been there for years, small fractures in the foundation that everyone pretended not to see until the whole structure finally gave way. Daniel left for college in 1988 and never really returned, at least not in the way his father had hoped. Robert had believed love was shown through shared labor years of sunburns, harvests, repairs done shoulder to shoulder. But Daniel had chased a different life. He'd studied business at Colorado State, married a woman from Boulder whose family owned a chain of hardware stores, and built a comfortable suburban future far removed from early morning chores and diesel fumes. The arguments started out quietly, then sharpened over time. Every time Daniel came home, he was reminded of how old and worn the house looked. The peeling paint, the faded furniture, the frugality that bordered on painful. Margaret darning socks, meals made from deer. Robert hunted because store-bought meat was too expensive. To Daniel, it felt like needless suffering. His parents were sitting on land worth millions, yet living like they were one bad month away from losing it all. The Thanksgiving before Robert disappeared ended in a shouting match that neighbors, hundreds of yards away, said they heard through closed windows. Daniel had brought paperwork that day, an offer he'd personally sought from Prairie Gold, complete with financial projections, and Daniel's offer came wrapped in numbers, projections of how $2.8 million could grow if handled wisely. Robert could retire, move somewhere smaller, and finally stop worrying about repairs, fuel costs, or what wheat was trading for that week. Daniel presented it like he was offering freedom, like he was saving his parents from their own stubbornness. Robert took the papers, read the first page, and wordlessly fed the whole lot into the fireplace. Months of Daniel's planning disappeared in a few seconds of flame, and something between them burned with it. Daniel exploded. He called his father selfish, said he cared more about long-dead ancestors than the family standing in front of him. He talked about responsibility, legacy, the future, and crossed lines that don't uncross easily. Robert listened quietly, hands folded, jaw set tight. Finally, when he spoke, he said some things were worth more than money, and if Daniel couldn't understand that, then maybe college had taught him to unlearn the things that mattered. Daniel left before dessert. His wife, Rebecca, rounded up their kids with a practiced efficiency, the kind that belied this as not being the first time she'd had to get her family out of an uncomfortable situation. Margaret watched them drive off and felt something inside her crack, the ache of loving two men who no longer knew how to love each other. After Robert vanished, Daniel's behavior became the town's favorite topic of hushed speculation. To outsiders, he looked like the model son. He took charge of the search with crisp efficiency, marshaling volunteers, speaking to the press, handling his mother's affairs with a seasoned professional air. But some people whispered his grief felt polished. His tears came at the right moments. His words were flawless. But his eyes, those stayed sharp, calculating, always moving on to the next problem. Margaret defended him fiercely. Everyone handles trauma differently, she said. Some people fall apart. Others hold themselves together with sheer force of will. Daniel was like his father that way, even if neither man would have ever admitted it. Still, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Margaret found herself thinking thoughts she didn't want to think, like the Tuesday before Robert disappeared, when Daniel showed up unannounced. Robert was in town picking up tractor parts, so Daniel sat with Margaret in the kitchen, sipping coffee and asking strangely careful questions about Robert's health, about how Margaret would manage if something happened, about whether Robert had updated his will. Margaret brushed it off as Daniel's insurance-trained mind doing what it always did, planning for worst cases. Or the phone call she'd overheard 3 days before, Robert vanished. She'd picked up the bedroom extension to make her own call, only to freeze at the sound of Robert's voice downstairs, angry in a way she rarely ever heard. He was talking to Daniel, telling him that whatever he was doing, it needed to stop. Immediately. That if Daniel had made agreements about the farm, they were void. That Robert would burn the land to bedrock before letting Daniel sell it out from under him. The call abruptly ended. When she brought it up with Robert later in the night, he merely brushed it off. Just Daniel being Daniel, he said. Now, 2 months after Robert's disappearance, Margaret sat opposite Detective Clark, trying to explain a strange, painful love inside a family coming apart one crack at a time. She wanted to protect Daniel. She wanted to believe his dealings with Wagner were harmless, misguided perhaps, but not malicious. Yet Clark kept circling back. Those 17 phone calls, the unexplained consultation fee, the timing of the arguments. The final night, Robert walked into a field and never returned. Daniel had returned to Denver after 3 grueling weeks of searching. He vowed to visit every weekend, but managed it only twice in the next month. His job, with each passing day, Daniel's job demanded more of him, and his family needed him too. Margaret knew it, at least in her mind, but deep in her heart, she felt abandoned, left alone in a house full of ghosts and questions she wasn't brave enough to face. By the summer of 2011, Robert Keller's disappearance had settled into that quiet category of small-town tragedies. One more unsolved mystery in a county that already had too many. The news crews packed up. Volunteers stopped calling. Detective Clark kept the case open, but it sat on a shelf with dozens of others where evidence ran out long before answers ever arrived. In this strange, painful in-between, Margaret learned to live, no longer a wife, not yet a widow. Nobody teaches you how to live in that kind of limbo. Without Robert there to hold the place together, the farm began to sag under its own weight. Margaret tried, Lord, she tried. She hired seasonal help she couldn't afford. But she'd never learned to run the equipment or juggle the delicate timing of planting and harvest. The first year, the wheat came in thin. The next year, she planted only half the fields. By the third year, great stretches of land lay fallow, quietly turning themselves back into prairie. Margaret would sit on the porch and watch, feeling like she was witnessing a slow death. The financial screws tightened. Property taxes ate what little savings she had left. Broken equipment stayed broken. The bank sent letters, courteous at first, then less so. Margaret took a minimum wage job at the library in Sterling, shelving books while patrons whispered behind their hands, "There she is, the missing farmer's wife." Poor thing. Imagine not knowing. She heard them even when they thought she didn't. The years went on and Daniel visited less often. His life kept getting bigger while Margaret seemed to shrink to the size of her grief. His kids hardly remembered their grandfather. Rebecca eventually stopped coming at all. Too many school events, too much going on at work, too many excuses that were probably true but still stung. Daniel came alone, fixed whatever had broken that week, slept in his old room, and headed back to Denver the next morning with a kind of relieved hurry he didn't bother to hide. Then in October 2013, Daniel sat his mother down at the same kitchen table, where countless family arguments had taken place, and laid out the numbers. Cold, unforgiving numbers. The farm was drowning. Her savings were gone. The mortgage was 6 months away from foreclosure. There was, he said, a way out. Prairie Gold Development was still interested. Not in the whole farm, just the eastern 200 acres Robert had barely used anyway. They were offering $750,000, enough to save the house, enough to wipe out the mortgage, enough to give Margaret a future that didn't involve choosing between groceries and property taxes. Margaret stared at the paperwork. Part of her wanted to push it away, to honor Robert's ironclad promise that the land would never be divided. But Robert wasn't there. She was, and life was becoming something she could no longer carry alone. Her hands shook as she signed the papers. She felt like she was betraying every vow she'd ever made. The sale closed that December. Prairie Gold moved in immediately, soil tests, geological surveys, the whole routine. Margaret deposited the check and tried not to think about what Robert might say if he knew desperation had forced her to do the very thing he'd feared most. She kept the remaining 140 acres. She told herself it was a compromise, not a surrender. The house was still hers. The barn still stood. Part of the Keller story still lived. Daniel took care of everything: negotiations, contracts, logistics. His signature was on all the official documents next to hers. He was helpful, efficient, reassuring, and Margaret was grateful. But lying awake at night, she sometimes wondered why Prairie Gold had been so unusually cooperative, almost as if they'd been waiting for this moment. Detective Clark learned of the sale and drove out in January 2014. He sat opposite Margaret in the living room, speaking softly, and asked about the timing, the offer, and whether Daniel had talked to Thomas Wagner during the process. Margaret admitted she didn't. Margaret had no idea if Daniel had spoken to Wagner again. Her son had handled everything. Clark made notes, his face tightening, but without evidence there was nothing to pursue. Robert was still missing. The case was still cold. And life, indifferent as weather, kept moving forward, whether anyone was ready or not. The years drifted by, settling on Margaret's life like layers of dust. 2014 blurred into 2015, then 2016, each one carrying her further from the night Robert vanished and closer to the quiet, reluctant acceptance that she might never learn the truth. She stopped expecting to hear his boots on the porch, stopped turning toward the door when the wind rattled the screen, stopped listening for a voice that wasn't coming back. On what would have been their 50th wedding anniversary, Margaret in 2017 drove to the little cemetery where their daughter rested beneath the cottonwood tree. She sat beside the headstone for hours, speaking softly into the stillness about love that endured, grief that refused to loosen its grip, and the harsh arithmetic of staying alive when the two people you loved most were buried or gone. By 2018, Merino had largely moved on. The old-timers remembered the search, the helicopters, the endless fields combed inch by inch. But the younger families, those who'd bought renovated farmhouses or new builds off the highway, had never known Robert Keller. The Methodist Church quietly removed the faded prayer request that had hung for 6 long years. Margaret had become just another elderly woman who lived alone at the end of County Road 34. A widow, though the law wouldn't call her that. The only thing that differentiated her was that Robert's body was never found. The file on Robert Keller lay accumulating a slow, suffocating layer of dust on Detective Clark's desk. Thomas Wagner ascended the corporate ladder of Prairie Gold to oversee company acquisitions across 3 states. Daniel Keller continued his successful career at his insurance firm, making partner. Life for everyone but Margaret moved on, and then everything changed on a clear morning in September 2018. Jesse Moore, 26, quiet, and working construction to pay off student loans from a graphic design degree that had led nowhere, was running the backhoe on the eastern section of what had once been Keller land. Prairie Gold owned those 200 acres now and was turning the old wheat fields into a sprawling mixed-use development. Jesse had spent 3 days digging irrigation trenches, 6 feet deep, the work repetitive enough to let his mind drift. He'd covered nearly a quarter-mile of trench when the backhoe's bucket struck something that didn't feel like soil. It wasn't rock. The machine didn't shudder the way rock made it shudder. It wasn't tangled roots either. This gave way with a strange, hollow thump, like breaking into a space that shouldn't exist underground. Jesse killed the engine and climbed down, the heat already pushing toward 90 degrees, though it was barely mid-morning. Carlos Rios, his supervisor, a man who had run construction crews longer than Jesse had been alive, walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. The two men stood at the edge of the open trench, staring down. What the backhoe had exposed wasn't natural. Even compressed by 7 years of soil, the dark green industrial tarp was unmistakable, the heavy-gauge kind used on job sites to protect equipment. But this tarp hadn't blown in or been discarded. It had been wrapped deliberately, folded with precision around something roughly 6 feet long. Zip ties cinched it tight at regular intervals. Carlos swore under his breath and called the foreman. The foreman called Prairie Gold's project manager. The project manager arrived, took one look, and went pale despite the heat. 30 seconds later, he dialed 911. In less than 40 minutes, the construction site no longer resembled a job site at all. Yellow tape ringed the trench. The first to arrive had been deputies from the Logan County Sheriff's Office, the very same department that had scoured these fields for Robert Keller 7 years earlier. Next came agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Finally, forensic specialists arrived, approaching the tarp-wrapped shape with that practiced, solemn focus with which they approached all their work. They pulled back the exposed tarp with the kind of care that archaeologists do when they're uncovering something ancient and fragile. Every step was deliberate. The team photographed the scene from every angle, measuring soil depth and composition, noting the exact position of the find in relation to landmarks. Steady, patient, reverential, the work flowed on. A short way off, construction workers stood near their trucks, smoking silently, their voices low. People instinctively whisper around death, even when it's long past. The excavation lasted 6 hours. Overseeing it all was Dr. Sarah Bennett, a forensic anthropologist in her 50s who had worked everywhere from mass graves in Bosnia to disaster zones on several continents. There wasn't much left in the world that could shake her, but something about this burial carefully hidden in darkness, on land that had supposedly been searched top to bottom, left her with a cold certainty about what they were going to uncover. The tarp came out of the ground in one piece. When they lifted it, the contents shifted just a little. That slight movement tensed up even seasoned investigators. The bundle was taken to the medical examiner's office in Sterling, where Dr. Michael Chang began the slow, meticulous process of unwrapping what 7 years in the soil had preserved. Immediately, the zip ties caught my eye. Industrial grade, heavy duty, the kind used in construction or manufacturing. And the tarp, virtually unchanged by time, thick plastic made to withstand moisture, deterioration, and discovery. The person who planted this body knew what they were doing. Inside were the skeletal remains of an adult male, wrapped again in a thinner layer of plastic sheeting. Most tissue was gone, but the depth of the burial and the airtight tarp had slowed decay just enough to leave material for analysis. It was complete, laid out carefully, arms at the sides. This wasn't a body dumped in panic. This was someone placed with intention. Shreds of clothes revealed jeans and what seemed to be a flannel shirt. The boots' sturdy red wings remained on the feet, holding up better than the man who once wore them. Dr. Chang spotted the trauma right away. A depressed fracture above the right temple, a hard blow from something heavy, or a violent fall against something that didn't budge. Either way, it was the kind of injury that kills. DNA testing would take weeks, but Dr. Chang had already studied Robert Keller's medical and dental records. The height matched around 5 feet 10 inches. The bone wear suggested a man in his mid to late 60s. And the dental work? A patchwork of old bridges and crowns, exactly the kind you'd expect from someone raised in rural America during the 1950s when going to the dentist usually meant pulling things out rather than saving them. On September 19th, 2018, 7 years and 6 months since Robert Keller walked into his wheat field and disappeared, Detective Clark made the drive down County Road 34 for a visit he hoped he'd never have to make. Margaret answered the door in a faded house dress. She was 74 now, hair like snow, hands permanently stained from years of tending the garden that had become her main companion. Clark watched her face as he told her they'd found Robert. He saw grief, but he also saw something else, a quiet, exhausted relief. After all those years, at least she finally knew. What had once been a dead-end missing person case for Clark had now blown wide open. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation immediately brought in a full task force. This was officially a homicide. Special Agent Linda Gallagher was put in charge. With 2 decades of experience in complex cases, she knew solving a cold case meant being open to questioning every assumption made in the original investigation. And now the forensic evidence of Robert's remains was telling a story that was quite different and shattered the quiet, simple explanation everyone had accepted for years. The skull fracture alone proved it. Robert Keller hadn't just walked away. He hadn't wandered off. He hadn't collapsed peacefully in a field. Something violent had happened, and someone had wanted his body to disappear. The fracture in Robert's skull demonstrated clear indications of perimortem trauma, meaning he was injured right around the time he died, and the pattern was unmistakable. A single, devastating blow. Not a struggle, not repeated hits. One strike powerful enough to knock him unconscious instantly, with death following minutes later from massive brain bleeding. Robert didn't wander off in confusion. He didn't collapse from a heart attack in his fields, then wrapped his body with almost clinical precision and buried him on his own land. And it was the industrial tarp that turned out to be the big break in the case. Agent Gallagher traced the lot number, printed along its edge, directly to the manufacturer, a company that sold the heavy-duty model in question almost exclusively to commercial developers. And what about buying records? Well, those pointed in one direction. They had bought 40 of precisely these tarps in January 2011, exactly 2 months before Robert disappeared. Inventory logs were messy, but the connection was hard to brush aside. Meanwhile, forensic teams compared soil from the gravesite with soil from surrounding areas. The verdict came not from dirt alone, but from the pollen trapped inside it. The sample covering Robert's body contained pollen from plants that bloom only in early spring, specifically mid to late March in northeastern Colorado. That lined up almost perfectly with Robert's disappearance and ruled out any idea that he had been buried later. Someone killed him within days of when he went missing and buried him immediately in a grave dug deep with purpose. A grave placed on land that ironically Prairie Gold planned to develop, the land Robert refused to sell. Considering that the old telephone records that Detective Clark had kept were revisited by Gallagher, those 17 calls between Thomas Wagner and Daniel Keller no longer felt like simple business chatter. They now looked a whole lot more like planning. So she went after the historical cell tower data, and that's when the picture sharpened. Thomas Wagner's cell phone displayed a travel pattern from Fort Morgan to Merino between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m., the night of March 14, 2011. But his alibi placed him in Denver. His phone, however, placed him near the Keller property during the precise window Robert disappeared. And that wasn't the only red flag. 2 prepaid cell phones, which had been purchased for cash at a Walmart in Sterling, were also linked to Wagner's number. The phones had only been activated during weeks leading up to Robert's death. Both phones moved together, traveling from Denver to the Merino area on March 14th. Then after the 15th of March, never used again, never recharged, just gone, much like Robert had been until his body surfaced 7 years later. Digging deeper into Prairie Gold's employee list from that time, Gallagher found 2 names worth attention: Kevin Thompson and Brian Hamilton. Both were security contractors in their early 30s. Both former military. Both had backgrounds in private security, and both had received large bonuses in April 2011, right when the Keller deal supposedly fell apart. Odd timing, to say the least. Within 6 months of Robert's disappearance, both men had left the company and scattered to different states. Shortly after that, their work histories went cold, way too cold to feel like coincidence. Then came the financial records, which drew a straight line back to Daniel Keller. Starting in June 2011, 3 months after his father died, Daniel began receiving monthly payments from a firm called Mountain West Advisory Services. These payments ran anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000 a month and continued for nearly 4 years, totaling more than $100,000 in all. But when investigators dug deeper into Mountain West Advisory Services, the company sending those checks, they found something curious. Once they peeled back layers of corporate paperwork, they found the firm was actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Prairie Gold Development Corporation. And that so-called consulting arrangement, smoke and mirrors, no contract, no reports, no emails, no deliverables, just money quietly flowing into Daniel Keller's account every month. When agents finally sat down with Daniel in February of 2019, he insisted the work was legitimate, that Prairie Gold had hired him for risk assessment and insurance analysis, but he couldn't produce a single document showing he'd ever done a moment of work. Those payments, however, had done plenty for him. They'd paid private school tuition for his kids and helped finance a vacation home in Breckenridge, a lifestyle that, frankly, didn't match an insurance agent's salary. When they showed Margaret the proof, the bank transfers, the shell corporation, the utter lack of actual consulting work, she said nothing. She sat staring off, hands clenched tightly in her lap. Agent Gallagher watched the moment a mother's hope quietly gave way to truth. 7 long years she had persuaded herself Daniel's involvement was innocent, that the phone calls, the land sale, the consultation fees were all just bad coincidence. Now she could no longer believe that. Her son had been paid for something, and the something likely involved his father's death. The investigation stretched into 2020, though it was slow going as Prairie Gold's lawyers battled every subpoena as if their lives depended on it. Thomas Wagner retained one of Denver's most prominent criminal defense attorneys and refused to utter a word without immunity. Daniel did the same. As for the 2 former security contractors, Kevin Thompson and Brian Hamilton, both had apparently vanished. Their last known addresses yielded nothing. Former neighbors shrugged, claiming they could barely recall either man. By 2021, prosecutors had collected enough circumstantial evidence to arrest someone, but not enough to ensure a conviction. They needed a confession. They needed one person, just one, to crack and trade truth for leniency. And so the waiting game began. Agent Gallagher persisted for 3 more years. She re-interviewed witnesses, dug into old records, looked for any inconsistency, no matter how small. Slowly, the once solid stories began to show tiny fractures. And in January 2025, 14 years after Robert Keller died, everything broke open. Thomas Wagner was 58 when the burden of the secret finally became too heavy. On paper, he'd built a respectable life. After leaving Prairie Gold in 2016, he'd grown into a high-level real estate consultant, advising companies across the West on land deals. He lived in a stylish Denver loft, drove a Tesla, and spent weekends golfing with attorneys and bankers. To outsiders, he looked like a man who had made it. But inside, Thomas Wagner was falling apart. He had spent 14 years walling off the truth, keeping the life he lived separate from the memory of a grave dug 2 meters deep on a quiet Colorado farm. The walls held through the first investigation, through the years when the case went cold, even through the shocking discovery of Robert's body in 2018. But guilt is patient, and guilt is relentless. First came the insomnia, then panic attacks, sudden waves of terror that left him gripping the steering wheel at stoplights, unable to breathe. He started drinking too much, concealing it from coworkers but not from himself. His marriage dissolved in 2022. His wife said she could no longer live with his emotional distance and whatever silent storm he carried. Therapy helped a little, but medication could only do so much. There's no prescription for the kind of poison that comes from killing a man who'd simply refused to sell his land, which Prairie Gold stored on the premises, tarps for equipment, not for bodies. Agent Gallagher had stayed quietly, steadily present in Thomas Wagner's life over the years, not by harsh interrogation, but by calm, periodic visits. She'd stop by his office with new questions, always polite, always controlled. Over time, the conversations began to feel less like investigator and suspect, and more like 2 people carrying the same truth, waiting to see which one would speak it out loud first. She grasped something crucial about confession. It usually doesn't come from breaking someone. It comes from giving them a way to stop carrying the weight. So by the time Thomas rang her directly in January 2025, she wasn't surprised, though she was prepared. His voice was hollow, whittled down to the bone by all his years of secrets. He didn't ask for immunity. He didn't want to negotiate. He just wanted to talk. Carrying this, he told her, is killing me in ways prison never could. They met in a small Boulder coffee shop, neutral ground far from Denver's courthouse shadows, where someone might recognize him. Gallagher brought her partner but no recorder. This wasn't the time or place for official statements. It was the moment when a man finally lays down the truth he can't outrun anymore. Thomas looked older than 58, not just older, drained. His eyes had that haunted, sleepless look you see in people who have been wrestling the same demon for far too long. He ordered a black coffee but barely touched it, and then he started talking. The plan, he insisted, had never been to kill Robert Keller. He said it more than once, almost pleading, as if intention could soften what had happened. Prairie Gold had been under enormous pressure from its investors. The Keller property was a linchpin in a massive development worth tens of millions. When Robert rejected the February offer, the executives began discussing alternative strategies. The kind of strategies you don't put in writing. Someone suggested that she make her point more persuasively. Another person mentioned that Robert's son, Daniel, appeared easier, more motivated by money than sentiment. Thomas had been assigned to feel Daniel out. Those 17 phone calls that Detective Clark had flagged years earlier proved to be precisely what they appeared. Two men dancing around a mutual frustration, each waiting for the other to say the quiet part out loud. Daniel wanted his inheritance. Thomas wanted the land. Taken together, they began to brainstorm methods by which to encourage Robert. Daniel arranged that so-called consulting fee, hoping the extra money might loosen his father's resistance. When that didn't work, Daniel hinted carefully that maybe his father needed to understand the consequences of refusing the sale. Thomas took that as a green light. He hired Kevin Thompson and Brian Hamilton, two former Marines who'd worked private security jobs where the lines between acceptable and necessary were often blurred. The plan, he insisted, was only intimidation. A late-night visit. Enough pressure to scare Robert into agreeing to the sale. But plans have a way of unraveling when real people get involved. They waited until Margaret was asleep, approached Robert in his yard, and tried to shake him up with threats and physical presence. But 67-year-old Robert Keller, with bad knees and a bad heart, was a farmer, a fighter, one who spent his entire life defending what was his. Rather than retreat, he grasped a shovel leaning against the barn and swung with all the force he had left. Thompson dodged the first blow, the second. By the third, chaos had taken over. It was three younger men trying to subdue an old farmer who fought like a man defending his entire life. And then it happened. Thomas said he wasn't sure who delivered the fatal strike, or maybe he couldn't admit it to himself. Maybe it was the shovel, maybe Thompson's fist, maybe Robert fell just wrong against the ground. But the blow to his temple was hard enough to drop him instantly. Thomas said it felt like watching someone's strings get cut. One moment, he was fighting. The next, he was gone. A panic had overcome them. In the darkness, the three men realized they hadn't just crossed a line. They'd obliterated it. Thompson took control, relying on military training to steady the chaos. They grabbed a tarp from his truck. Hamilton retrieved the heavy-duty Prairie Gold tarps meant for construction work, and the cover-up began. Old and living a life far from home. But knowing something is wrong is one thing. Understanding the truth, this truth, is something no mother is ever prepared for. Thomas Wagner's confession had revealed only part of what had happened. What he didn't say out loud was just as telling. He'd painted himself as the reluctant one, the man who'd been swept along by stronger personalities, by corporate pressure, by Thompson's aggression, by Daniel's frustrations. Gallagher recognized the tactic instantly, but she also heard raw honesty woven through his story. The details matched the evidence. The timeline aligned. The emotion was real. And so, after years of stonewalling, Wagner agreed to put everything on record. His attorney all but begged him not to. But Thomas had reached the end of what he could carry. He signed the papers, waived his rights, and spent 6 straight hours giving a detailed, painful account of the night Robert Keller died. And the 14 years spent holding that secret together with lies, fear, and quiet desperation. Once his statement was secured, the clock started ticking. On February 12, 2025, Just about exactly 14 years and 11 months from the day Robert walked into his field for the last time, state and federal agents came together in a simultaneous sweep across 3 states: Denver, Phoenix, Sacramento. Warrants were executed before dawn, and just like that, everything breaks open. Thomas Wagner was taken into custody without incident. Daniel Keller was arrested outside his Denver office looking stunned and pale. Kevin Thompson was found in Phoenix, doing private security work. Brian Hamilton was picked up in Sacramento after years of drifting between jobs. The charges were amazing: conspiracy to commit murder, manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and on Daniel, several counts of fraud in connection with the sale of the Keller land. Wagner's confession gave prosecutors the map, but investigators had spent weeks gathering the nails that would hold the case together, even if he tried to pull away. Walmart security footage also confirmed that Thompson purchased the prepaid phones in early 2011. A hardware store receipt showed Hamilton purchasing tools consistent with the burial. Financial records tied every man to Prairie Gold's hidden payments, tracing money like footprints across years of lies. The story hit Merino harder than any winter storm ever had. A town of 347 people, where everyone knew everyone, where the Keller name had been spoken with respect for generations, was forced to confront the unthinkable. Robert Keller hadn't simply vanished. He'd been murdered, and one of the people who helped hide it had been his own son. And then there was a special service at the Methodist Church where Robert once handled the offering plates and balanced the books. It wasn't a funeral. Robert had been mourned. It was something far more delicate, a grieving for trust, for innocence, for the belief that such darkness couldn't grow in soil they all shared. Main Street's diner was filled with neighbors who couldn't believe the news. It was a place where no coffee cup was ever empty, and gossip spread faster than the wind. Many had searched those very fields back in 2011. Some had walked within feet of Robert's grave, and now they knew that the land had been concealing a secret much too heavy to fathom. Margaret Keller, now 81, thinner than she used to be, her posture bent by grief more than age, denied every media request. Reporters camped on the edge of town hoping for a quote from "the widow who never knew," but Margaret wanted none of their spectacle. She only agreed to see one person, Agent Gallagher. They sat together in the living room of the old farmhouse, the same room where Margaret had waited night after night for a husband who would never return. Robert's photos still lined the walls. His jacket still hung by the back door. The house smelled faintly of old books, cedar, and memories. Margaret spoke softly. She told Gallagher she had known for years that something wasn't right. Not enough to accuse, not enough to act. Just enough to lie awake at night wondering why Daniel's voice on the phone had sounded rehearsed, why he had pushed so hard to sell the land, why he avoided certain questions. "A mother knows," she said, "even when she wishes she didn't. But knowing, and knowing this, that Daniel had been pulled into something so monstrous, were two very different things." Her hands were trembling as she said it. Even when the lie is unbearable, especially as it involves a son and a father. Margaret had seen the signs long before the arrests: the sudden money, the vacation home, and the private schools for grandchildren who would grow up never knowing that their opportunities had been funded by a crime that left their grandfather buried like refuse on land he once cherished. Years earlier, she had asked Daniel directly if he knew anything at all, about what happened to Robert. Daniel had looked her straight in the eye and told her no, and Margaret believed him, because the alternative, the concept that she had raised a man capable of such cruelty, was too devastating to hold. Thomas Wagner pleaded guilty under a plea agreement, accepting a 20-year sentence in exchange for his admissions to voluntary manslaughter and conspiracy, and for full cooperation. His testimony turned the case from a puzzle into a clear narrative, a terrible one, but solid. He revealed it was Daniel who had first suggested that Robert needed convincing. Daniel provided maps of the property, details of Robert's routines, and even Margaret's sleep schedule. He helped build their alibis, and he profited for years disguised as a consultant, collecting monthly payments that were little more than installments on his father's death. Finally located after years of quiet relocation through various states and jobs, Kevin Thompson and Brian Hamilton claimed they had been hired only to intimidate, never to kill. They said Robert's death had been accidental, followed by a panicked cover-up. Their attorneys pushed for lesser charges, pointing fingers at Daniel and Wagner in an attempt to rewrite the hierarchy of guilt. But the prosecutors had enough evidence to keep all four men facing long sentences. Even with legal maneuvering, plea bargaining, and contradictory testimonies, the case was strong. His long-time employment with the insurance company was immediately terminated. Within weeks, his wife, Rebecca, had filed for divorce and moved with their children to Boulder. The Breckenridge vacation home, once the pride of their social gatherings, had been seized as an asset acquired with criminal proceeds. 30 years of climbing the professional ladder collapsed overnight. Margaret was present for Daniel's arraignment. She sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, watching her only son make his appearance in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, head bowed. Finally, when he looked up, their eyes met. For a moment, she searched his face for the bright-eyed boy she once raised. She saw something regret, or perhaps just fear, but she could no longer tell which was real. She had loved this child from before he entered the world, had defended him, nurtured him, mourned his distance. But now, staring at him across the courtroom, she saw only a stranger borrowing her son's features. Meanwhile, the land at the center of everything, the Keller farm, became a new battlefield. It wasn't long before federal investigations into racketeering and conspiracy hammered the Prairie Gold Development Corporation. What had seemed a Hall of Fame-bound career of bold, secretive land buys suddenly took on a dark light. The executives maintained they knew nothing of Wagner's illegal methods, producing reams of paperwork purporting to insulate headquarters from field operations. It didn't matter. Public trust evaporated. Their Colorado projects froze under legal review. Investors backed away. Prairie Gold's downfall was slow, but certain. Through her attorney, she announced that she would be donating the remaining 140 acres of Keller property to the Colorado Natural Heritage Program for permanent conservation. No sales, no development, no strip malls, no subdivisions. The land would stay prairie, pasture, and open sky, just the way Robert had loved it. At a small press conference in Sterling, Margaret stood before microphones, her hands shaking but her voice steady. She spoke about Robert's love for the land, about how he had seen ownership as a duty, never a right. She spoke about loss, the kind that changes the very shape of a life. She spoke about betrayal and the lengthy, unmarked path to forgiveness, though she did not say if Daniel ever would walk that path in her heart. And she spoke of memory, how land remembers, how families remember, how silence remembers, and how the Keller farm would remember Robert, not for how his life ended, but rather how he lived on that soil. Something remarkable happened on the Keller land in April of 2025, on what would have been Robert and Margaret's 58th anniversary. Dozens of volunteers from across Logan County showed up, donning gloves and armed with tools and seed bags. They planted native prairie grass and wildflowers across the very fields where search parties once combed every inch, desperate to find Robert. Their hands pressed into the soil that had hidden him for nearly 15 years, soil that now finally could begin to heal. Margaret moved quietly among them, accepting gentle hugs, handshakes, and whispered condolences. People thanked her for her strength. Some apologized for never suspecting the truth. Others just stood beside her in silence. And Margaret truly tried to find some small measure of peace in knowing that though so much had been lost, Robert's land would stay alive. The trials were scheduled for the fall of 2025. They promised months of arguments, questions about intent, blame, and legal definitions that would attempt to untangle just how much responsibility belonged to each man. Attorneys would debate the degrees of guilt, experts would testify, and the courtroom would fill with people seeking answers, accountability, or closure. But in many ways, especially for the people of Merino, and for Margaret, the real ending had already occurred. Not justice precisely. Justice can feel clean and decisive. What they had was truth, and truth is rarely gentle. A truth that had scorched everything it touched. One family, one town, one life's work, and a man's memory. But it had finally ended the torment, speculation, and unresolved grief for 14 years. Robert Keller was nowhere to be found. He had been murdered because of his refusal to give up the land his family had worked since 1889, back when his grandfather broke the first acres with a mule team. His own son had taken part in the plot that ended his life. His wife had lived nearly a decade and a half in the shadow of lies she didn't know she was carrying. But his land would outlast all of them. Now protected by law, preserved by choice, and remembered by all who ever walked its fields. A piece of Colorado that would never again be for sale. Because some inheritances matter far more than money, even when accepting the truth comes at the highest possible cost.